Good morning, everybody. I'm Les Binet, and welcome to Marketing Effectiveness in the Digital Era. I'm Les Binet. I'm Head of Effectiveness at Adam and Eve DDB, which many of you will know is a creative agency here in London. And my job as Head of Effectiveness is to measure the effectiveness of our marketing, communications and advertising, to understand what's effective and what isn't, to understand what the rules of effectiveness are, and to help use all that knowledge to make our work better. And I hope today to pass some of that on to you guys. I'm going to be talking about how marketing works, how to make it effective, and in particular, how the rules of effectiveness are or are not changing in the digital era. Okay, so why am I qualified to do any of this? Well, I'm tremendously lucky in that over the last 13 or 14 years, I've been working very closely with the IPA, the body that represents the advertising industry here in the UK, and looking at their data on effectiveness. The IPA has one of the world's largest databases of effectiveness information. It contains information on over 1,500 advertising campaigns over a 30 to 40 year period. And this huge database contains information on what media those campaigns used, what the strategies were, what the creative work was like, the style, the influence models that were used, and so on. But crucially, it also contains information on what actually happened. It contains details of the business results. The database tells us what the sales gains were, what happened to market share, to penetration, loyalty, price, profit, and so on. So it is probably the world's most detailed database of effectiveness information. And over the last 13 to 14 years, my colleague Peter Field and I have been mining that data to try and answer the questions that we see here. First of all, what are the ingredients for effective marketing? Secondly, are the rules, the ingredients, are they changing? And also, do the rules vary from one brand to another, one category to another, one situation to another. We've published 4 books so far on our research. The most recent being a book called Effectiveness in Context, which came out just over a year and a half ago. And that's really what I wanted to focus on today. But before I really get started, I'd like to summarize the central idea that lies at the heart of all our recent research. And this is the idea that marketing works in 2 very different ways over different timescales. So the first way that marketing works, and by works, I mean sell stuff. The first way that marketing can sell stuff is what we call sales activation. Now, what do I mean by that? Sales activation is where you hit people with some kind of marketing activity which is intended to produce an immediate response, to get people to do something now or very soon. So it could be get people to click on a link. It could be to get people to visit your website. It could be to like it. It could be to buy something. The point is you want people to do something, and you want people to do something very soon. We're not talking about necessarily long-term changes. You want an immediate response. So that's the world of performance marketing. It's the world of promotional marketing. It's the world of direct marketing, and much digital marketing works in that way. Classic example would be, for example, paid search, where the aim is to get people to click on the link and then go somewhere else on the internet, visit a website, something like that. Okay, now when you get that stuff right, you can get some really big immediate sales effects and behavioral effects. Hit people with a wave of DM or outbound emails, and you can get big spikes in your sales, as shown by this graph here. And that can be highly efficient, and if you get it right, can produce a great ROI. But there is a problem with this stuff, which is that, as anyone who's worked in direct response performance marketing will know, if you turn it off, then what happens is that sales slump back down again very quickly. The decay rates are very fast, which is why the spikes here are shown as spikes with quite a fast decay down. So, for example, if you do direct response TV, you'll typically see that the responses that you get from that come through in about 24 hours. If you do direct mail, then probably most of the responses will come through in a week or so. If you're doing paid search, when you turn it off, probably the responses decay to almost nothing pretty much instantly. So what about if you want a longer term change in people's behavior? Well, in order to do that, you've got to change something inside their heads. Rather than just getting them to do something, you've got to change how they think and feel about your brand. So that's brand building. Now, that's a much harder job. Changing people's minds is a slower process, more like a training process. And it typically requires repeated exposures. If you want to teach people a new pattern of behavior, new habits, new beliefs, then typically you need to talk to them multiple times. But if you get it right, those effects last. So typically for brand building, the sales pattern looks like this. Each exposure to brand activity produces typically smaller increases in sales than you would see from performance marketing, but the decay rate for those sales effects is slower, and therefore each of exposure to brand building will ratchet up the base level of sales by a little bit each time in this kind of step function that we see here shown in blue. So in the short term, the effects are smaller, but the long-term growth is bigger. So brand building is a good way to get long-term behavioral change and long-term growth in the base sales. The other thing that brand building can do is change price sensitivity by effectively changing the criteria by which people make the buying decision. So if you can persuade people that your brand is better quality, has better social credentials, is more ethical, whatever it is you're doing, then you can reduce the role of price in the final decision making. And so brand building typically has a double effect on the bottom line. Long-term growth in base sales volume, reduced price sensitivity, the ability to charge higher prices, and hence higher margins. So more volume, more margin, and so a double contribution to profit. Okay, so that's the way these two ways that marketing and advertising can work. But there's a sort of dilemma here. If you look at the short term, then you can see here over a period of about 6 months or so, those activation effects, those performance spikes, those direct marketing effects, they dominate. The area under the red line here in the first 6 months is greater than the area under the blue line. But in the long term, by which I mean 2 years or so, the brand building is the main driver of growth. Over the long term, over the whole of this period, the area under the blue line is greater than the area under the red line. So brand building is the main driver of long-term growth, long-term sales, and particularly long-term profit. And we find this in every category we've looked at. Brand building is always the most important contributor to the bottom line in the longer term. But in the short term, 6 months or less, activation effects appear to dominate. So that's the theory that lies at the heart of all our research. Is it just a theory? No. Here's a real example measured with econometric modeling for a real brand. This shows the effect of 6 bursts of advertising over a 4 or 5 year period for a service brand. I can't say who it is, but anyway, what you can see here is econometric modeling identifies 2 effects that the campaign had. The red area shows the short-term activation effects. The yellow area shows the long-term brand effects. And yes, in this particular case, although the red spikes are the easiest to see in the short term, most of the sales comes from the yellow area. About 60% of the sales volume comes from the brand effects and about 40% comes from the activation effects. Remember that ratio, 60-40, because you're going to see that again. Okay, so 2 ways that you can sell stuff, and actually everything you do will have a little bit of a short-term effect and a little bit of a long-term effect, but the mix is different for different activities. So performance marketing typically has big short-term activation effects. It's very good at getting people to do stuff now, but small long-term effects. Performance marketing doesn't tend to be very good at changing people's opinions and building the brand long-term. Brand advertising is the opposite. The short-term activation spikes are smaller, but there's much more of a long-term effect. Can you do both at once? Well, everything does a bit of both, but actually there's a trade-off between them. If you're doing a good job with your activation, good short-term selling job, typically you won't be doing very good work on the brand, and vice versa. Later on, we'll see why. But for now, just trust me, it's hard to do both brand and activation well in the same piece of communication. But you do need to do both because they work in synergy. Here's a real example for a real brand, a brand of milk called Cravendale, which you probably know. It's a brand of filtered milk, which tastes fresher and lasts longer because of the different filtration process that's used. We helped Cravendale to roll out in the UK about 15 years ago. And they adopted a sort of regional test and learn approach with using different mixes of different marketing mixes in different regions of the country and in different store catchment areas. So we had this lovely situation where we could look at stores that had no marketing support. That's the left-hand bar. That's the sort of base level of sales that they got organically from just rolling the product out. Then stores that just had brand TV. And what we found is that growth was 5% faster in the stores that had brand TV. Then we had stores that just had activation in the form of direct mail. Now, growth was 11% faster than the base level in those stores. And then finally, we had a group of stores that had both brand and activation working together, both TV and direct marketing. And growth was 33% faster in those stores. So what you can see here is that the effect of TV and DM together, 33%, is actually almost twice as large as the separate effects of TV and DM, 5 plus 11, which is 16. So if you like, putting brand and activation together, each enhances the other and it doubles your effectiveness. So you do need brand, you do need activation, you need both working together, you need short-term and long-term, but you do need different kinds of activity to do those two jobs. And that for me is the very essence of an effective marketing plan. So with that idea in mind, how do you balance brand and activation? What are the principles? What should the content be? What should the media be? Well, principle number one is to talk to the right people. You can go narrow and tightly targeted. You can go broad and go for broad reach. And in fact, you need to do both. Narrow, tightly targeted communications tend to be highly efficient, but not very effective in that they produce responses at low cost, but actually a relatively small proportion of contribution to volume. For example, if you're doing performance marketing, direct response type stuff, the group that will tend to produce the best response rates will typically be your existing customers or people who've bought you before. They're already warm to you. They're already receptive to communications from you. So you'll tend to get high response rates. But actually, if you look at the effect on market share growth shown here from the IPA data bank, talking to your existing customers, while it gives you the best response rates, produces the smallest contribution to growth. So this is the world of CRM, loyalty marketing, community management in social media. And let's not forget customer service, probably the most powerful CRM tool in your armory. Really important, really efficient, but actually the smallest contributor to growth. Talking to potential hot prospects, the people who are shopping now, people who are interested in buying you, will produce better contributions to growth. This is the world of shopper marketing, programmatic, paid search, performance marketing. This tends to produce bigger contributions to your growth rates and your sales, because as we know from the work done by academics who work in this area, particularly the people at Ehrenberg Bass in Australia, Byron Sharp, Andrew Ehrenberg, decades of research have shown that when brands grow, they primarily grow by recruiting extra customers rather than by increasing loyalty amongst existing customers. So that's your main job, and that produces bigger growth rates. But actually, the biggest growth rates of all come from talking to customers and non-customers together, talking to everyone who buys the category. Broad reach brand advertising will typically produce the lowest direct response rates, but the biggest long-term contributions to sales, market share, growth, and profit. So you need all of these things working together, but the main driver of long-term growth is that one on the right, broad reach advertising. And this is a really important lesson to learn. We obsess about targeting in marketing these days, And targeting can increase the efficiency of your campaign by about 10% typically. But reach is much more important for effectiveness. Getting your reach right can double, triple, or quadruple the effectiveness of your campaign. So the most important job is first and foremost to make sure you reach enough people, and then secondly, to fine-tune your targeting to increase your effectiveness. So efficiency, sorry. Effectiveness first, efficiency second. Reach first, targeting second. Really important lesson. Okay, so you need to reach as many people as you can within the category, and I literally mean anyone who might buy the category in the next 2 to 3 years. That's the target audience for your brand advertising. And the primary job amongst those people is just to make sure that they think of you at all. The main reason that the brands don't get bought is not that people reject them or think that they're not for them or in some way think that they're inferior. It's simply that they don't think of them at all. So what you need to do is to make sure that anyone who might be buying the category in the next 2 or 3 years is going to think of you when they do. You need to make sure your brand really comes to mind quickly and easily. And I don't just mean that they've heard of you, but that they think of you and think of you automatically. So there's a kind of continuum of mental availability, if you like, share of mind, from awareness, which is where people recognize your brand and go, okay, yeah, I've heard of them, you know, that would be acceptable, to salience, where they automatically think of your brand when they think about the category and they actively seek you out. Much better to be at that level of being the no-brainer, the automatic choice. And at the very top level, you have brands that people really naturally talk about. They're famous brands that are famous beyond their category. I'm talking about, you know, the Nikes, the Apples, the Googles, in fact, the brands that are part of popular culture, brands you just can't ignore. When you get to that level of fame, then people talk about your brand and become part of your sales force, if you like. So we typically see increasing returns to mental availability and share of mind. In many areas of marketing, we see diminishing returns, but in this area, we see increasing returns. To be the most famous brand in your category is a tremendously powerful thing. We find that that kind of fame can increase the efficiency of your advertising by a factor of 4 and produces the most profitable advertising there is. So broad reach, famous. And then the third ingredient when you think about content is to make sure that when people do think about you, we want people to think of you automatically. And when they do, we want them to think well of you. What do I mean by that? You might think that this is about telling people about your products and services so that they believe that your products and services are better than other people's. Persuasion, you know, good rational reasons to buy. There is a role for that in marketing, but it's surprisingly small. What we find is if you are trying to get an immediate response from people, if you're doing performance marketing, direct marketing, activation as we call it, then the highest response rates, the biggest activation effects tend to come from rational persuasion. If you're talking to people who are in the market, shopping now, and you want to convert them, tell them about your products, tell them about your services, tell them about your prices, tell them where to buy. Don't bother seducing them or charming them or entertaining them. Just give them relevant information to close the deal, and that will maximize your activation effects. But if you want to do that long-term job of brand building, if you want to get long-term behavior change, long-term changes in brand preference, don't bother with rational arguments, because in fact that produces the smallest brand effects. For that long-term job, it's much more about emotional strategies. It's about creating emotions, feelings, associations that will color people's judgment of your brand in the long term. Because when people are not actively shopping for a brand, they're not really particularly interested in what you have to say about it. They're not particularly interested in products and prices, but what they are interested in is stories and human interest and things with universal human relevance. They're interested in penguins and cartoons and jokes. So if you want to get attention from non-shoppers to do the long-term job, and you have to if you can do brand building, then you need to do things which are much more interesting and much more universally relevant. And those emotional experiences create longer term memories. We know from psychology that emotional memories last a lot longer than memories about facts and figures. So to do the long-term job, you need emotions and feelings and associations to get people's attention and to create long-term memories. And that means that how people feel about your brand in the long run matters much more than what they think about it. The role for rational persuasion is really quite small, and it's only in the sort of final furlong as you're converting people. So that means it's really important that your broad reach brand advertising is creative, because creativity arouses more emotions. We find that ads that win creative awards get a bigger emotional response, and creativity makes brands more famous. The ads that win creative awards are much more likely to be talked about. They're the things that people talk about at work, in the pub, at home, at the dinner table with their family. So creativity means more emotion, more fame, and we know that those things turbocharge your sales results. In fact, creative award winners are typically 10 or 11 times more efficient at selling stuff than ordinary advertising in the long run. So creativity is a tremendously powerful force for business, but it needs commitment. You need to make sure you've got the great ads, but you also need to make sure you've got enough spend behind them, because you need to spend in order to get the reach and exposure that you need to hit as many people as you can over as many times as you can to do that brand training job that I talked about earlier on. And there's a rule for how much you should spend. We've known it for decades. It's called the share of voice rule. So if you compare a brand's share of voice, its share of advertising spend, against its share of market, its share of sales, then brands that set their share of voice above their share of market tend to grow, other factors being equal. Brands that set their share of voice below their share of market tend to shrink, go into decline, all factors being equal. And the rate at which a brand grows or shrinks is typically proportional to what we call ESOV, extra share of voice, which is the gap between share of voice and share of market. So share of voice minus share of market. We've known about that rule for many, many years. Many different researchers have found it again and again, going back to people in the 1970s through to today. And we see no sign that that rule is changing over time, even despite all the changes in the media marketplace that we've seen recently. So that's the first budget rule. Make sure your share of voice is big enough. The second budget rule is to make sure that you split your budget correctly between brand and activation. Typically, we find that efficiency is optimized when the comms budget is about 60% brand building and about 40% activation. Now, remember, I mentioned the 60-40 split early on. Typically, what we see is when you analyze the sales patterns, about 60% of your sales come from long-term brand effects and about 40% from short-term activation effects. And that's really why you need to split your budget 60-40. As you see, if you go either side of that 60-40 ratio, this chart shows an overall measure of effectiveness based on 6 different business performance metrics, from sales through to profit. Typically, as I say, 60-40 is optimum. If you go too far to the left and you're not doing enough brand building, then your effectiveness is compromised, because yes, you're hitting people with performance marketing, but they're not warmed up, and therefore response rates will be low. Go too far to the right, you're not doing enough activation. Yes, you're charming people and making people want your brand, but you're not converting them efficiently, and therefore effectiveness is compromised. So you need a balance. You need to lead with brand and you need to support with activation, about 60-40. But it does vary by category and it does vary by marketing context, as we put it. One of the important areas to think about is what happens when you've got a brand that's very innovative. It could be a new brand or a new company or a new variant of a brand. And what we find is that innovators are slightly different. So, for example, when a brand or a company first launches, in the first year, typically they need to go activation heavy. So the red there is the activation, the blue there is the brand, and this is the optimum. So for those brand new brands, brand new companies, when they first launch, these startups need to go about 65% brand, 35% activation. So go activation heavy at first. But as they grow and as they mature, they need to dial up the brand spend. So by the time they reach maturity, they're at the typical 60-40 split. And for the really big brands, the ones that are market leaders, they need to go even higher to sort of 70-30. Small brands typically need slightly more of the activation, so more like the early growth pattern that you see here. So it is different for different companies at different stages of maturity and different size. So many of you will be working on slightly smaller brands, and therefore you may well want to go a little bit more biased towards activation, but you do still need to do brand building. What about online? In the digital world, are the rules different? And yes, the answer is yes. There is a difference, but it's not what most people think. What we find is in the digital space, activation is much more efficient than in the old offline world. The cost of reaching people with direct performance type activity is typically lower. Digital comms don't have the costs associated with them that old paper-based type media had, direct mail, for example. Targeting can be more efficient if you've got people's names and addresses and emails. And so activation is more efficient. And what that means actually is you don't need to spend so much on activation. You still need to reach people, but you don't have to spend as much. And therefore, actually, the activation part of the budget can be smaller, but you still need to do the spending on brand. So what we typically see is that in the digital world, it's more like a 70-30 split, or even a 75-25 split. So very innovative brands need 72-28 in favor of brand. Brands that are highly researched online typically need a sort of 74-26 split. Brands that sell online, 74-26. And brands that sell on a subscription model, like say Dollar Shave Club, as many digital brands do these days, also need a 74-26 split. So in the digital world, brand is even more important as a part of the mix than it used to be in the old offline world. Budgets can be smaller because there are efficiencies to be yielded from digital marketing, but the proportion is tilted more towards brand. So brand is as important as ever, possibly more. What does that mean for media? Well, as I say, it's hard to do brand and activation well in the same piece of communication, and here's why. If you're doing sales activation, you need to be tightly targeted on the people most likely to respond right now. So that's, typically people who are shopping right now, people with whom you maybe have an existing relationship, the hot prospects. Those people need to be served highly relevant information, stuff that will help close the deal right now. So that's typically information rich, often focusing on products and prices. And the third element you need is responsiveness. You need to make it easy for people to, you know, respond right now in any way possible. Ideally, you know, one-click ordering would be the ideal here. So sales activation favors targeted, information-rich, responsive media. Brand building is the complete opposite. For brand building, you need, as I said earlier, to reach anyone who might be buying the category in the next 2 to 3 years. So it's much broader reach. You need to hit those people with highly creative, emotional, sort of touchy-feely advertising, because they're not really interested in your products and services right now, most of them, but they are interested in cats and cartoons and jokes and stuff like that, and stories. So you need emotionally rich media, and you need to make sure that what you do is memorable, which also favors creative, emotional stuff. So brand building favors broad reach emotional media, and that particularly favors video. So text can produce an emotional response, but pictures tend to produce bigger emotional responses. Moving pictures produce even better emotional responses, and moving pictures with music produce the best emotional responses of all. So what we find is that whether you're doing online or offline, video formats produce the best brand effects. So this is why you need to do brand and activation separately, because they require quite different media ingredients. Now, as I said, reach is really, really important. Emotion is really, really important. So how do you do that in today's world for brand building? Well, the IPA Touchpoint survey gave us a great snapshot of UK media consumption just before lockdown. This is data from January. The pattern is very similar in other countries, by the way. This is consumption of commercial media in terms of reach on the y-axis and hours per day on the x-axis, and it's just for commercial media. So if you want to get the maximum reach and exposure for adults as a whole, actually outdoor produces the biggest reach. TV is a close second, commercial TV is a close second. And of course, commercial TV will tend to produce the bigger emotional response because it's based on video, although one can do a certain amount of video with outdoor these days. That's then followed by the digital media, the functional internet, the world of paid search, social media, which carries a lot of video, and then moving down into other media on the left-hand side. And then obviously there's a lot of change going on there. So for example, online video and online channels in general are growing fast. But there's also a huge schism between different age groups. So different age groups and different demographics consume media very differently. So this is the picture for all adults, but actually if you look at younger people, they tend to consume more of the digital media. And if you look at older people, then they tend to consume more of the traditional media. During lockdown, things changed. So the IPA Touchpoint survey kept running during lockdown, and what we saw was some big changes there. So obviously exposure to outdoor collapsed because people weren't going out, but people began to watch more TV, watch more online video, watch more social media, bit less use of the functional internet for work and study. So video really kind of came into its own during lockdown as people became more leisure focused and more home focused. And as I say, different social groups consumed that video in different ways. For the younger audiences, video was primarily being consumed online. Social media was the top medium in terms of reach and dwell time, followed by TV and other online video. So if you combine all online video together for the younger groups, online video would be the main emotional brand building channel, if you like, with TV as a support. And of course, YouTube, a big part of that. And for older groups, TV remains the primary way that they consume video. I looking here at 55 pluses as the most extreme group. And they're an audience that many advertisers can't afford to neglect, because remember, there's also a schism between these two groups in terms of income and affluence. Older consumers have much more money to spend these days. Unfortunately, the millennials are still the poorest group. And so in terms of spending power, the group on the right can't be ignored, particularly in categories like, for example, big ticket purchases like cars, which are almost entirely bought by the group on the right. So any mass brand these days needs to talk typically to both of these groups. And so they'll need a balanced diet of both traditional media like TV and new media like online video. Let me give you a real example of that. On Friday, we launched the latest in our series of John Lewis Christmas ads. So we've been doing the John Lewis Christmas ads now for over 10 years. And the way we launch those ads every year, as we did on Friday, we start with online video. So we do seeding in social media and in the press, and we invite people to watch the ads on YouTube and at the John Lewis website. And within minutes of releasing the ads online, we practically break the internet with people desperate to be the first in their social group to see the ads. Typically, we get about 50 million exposures a year, 50 million views through online video, with YouTube being a big part of that. But that's not all. Later that day, in the first day of the campaign, the ads go live on TV, and we've had a day basically to prep people so that they will actually tune in to the ad break to watch the ads on TV, and then the ads run on TV for 6 weeks up to Christmas, and that brings us typically about 500-600 million views for the brand advertising shown in green, and almost as many again, sometimes more, for the supplier funded TV, which is actually a form of activation where we have short TV ads showcasing products that can be bought at John Lewis, like TVs, hi-fis, phones, whatever, in a style that is themed into the brand campaign, but paid for by the manufacturers of those brands. So with brand and activation together on TV and on online video, we're getting around 1 billion exposures every Christmas. And that's what it takes to move the dial in marketing. Huge numbers of views. And really, you can only get that from using both online and offline together in synergy. And that, I would say, is what big brands really need to do these days. Now, many of you might be working for smaller companies that can't afford TV, but you will need to use that combination of online and offline media in some form. It's not either or, it's both and. Okay, so that's a very quick canter through 13 or 14 years of research, really. There's an awful lot more detail in there in the books, and I would urge you to seek them out and read them, particularly Effectiveness in Context, which will be the most relevant one for those of you who work for smaller brands. But these are the key points I'd like you to remember. Yes, the fundamental rules of marketing have not changed in the digital era. The media that are available, the tools available have changed, but the fundamental rules of buying behavior have not. Brands still need reach, share of mind, and emotional appeal to grow in the long term. That requires creative advertising. Creativity boosts your efficiency, but you also need to spend enough. There's no free lunch. You need to make sure your budget is big enough, and you need to make sure it's balanced between brand and activation, typically 60-40, but your optimum mix might be slightly different. The digital revolution is making activation easier, but that means that your brand activation mix needs to be slightly more tilted towards brand building if you're playing in the digital space. And whoever you are, you need to use both online and offline media in synergy, particularly as you begin to grow and you become a scale up, as you tilt from startup to scale up. Offline media become increasingly important to get the reach that you'll need. So smart marketers use both in balance. Okay, so that's really all I have to say today. What I'd like to do now is I'd like to switch over to you guys and hear what your questions are. So hopefully anyone who's got questions can submit them via the comments page. Hopefully some of you will have been doing that already as we've been going through. So first question that's coming up is from Tony. And the question is, what is the profit effect of brand and activation campaigns? You've shown the 60-40 effect on sales. I'm interested in the different cost profiles and therefore profit impact. Okay, that's a good question. I have to say that's harder to answer because it's less well quantified. It's easier for people to measure the sales effect than it is for them to measure the profit effect. And therefore we have fewer data points. But typically brand building is an even bigger contributor to profit. And the reason for that is that, as we showed earlier, that brand has a bigger sales effect in terms of volume, but it also has this second effect on price sensitivity. The really, really profitable marketing campaigns that we've seen are the ones that don't just increase volume and get market share growth, but they actually make people less price sensitive, and so they increase margins, and that tends to have a double effect on profitability. So I can't quantify it for you, but what I can tell you is that the brand is even more important when it comes to profit. Right, do we have another question? Okay, learnings from COVID. From Alice has asked, what are the learnings from COVID stroke the last recession? Okay, well, I'll start with the last recession. We do know that things behave slightly differently in recessions. One of the important differences is during a recession, during a crisis, typically what happens is that media prices drop. Because obviously a lot of people are forced to cut their advertising budgets, and therefore the cost of buying ratings, cost of writing GRPs, all those costs tend to fall. So advertising and marketing become cheaper. Also, for many brands, they'll find that their competitors are not advertising, so they don't need to advertise as much in order to get share of voice. So buying share of voice becomes cheaper during a recession. And we also find that market share tends to respond more to share of voice during a recession. So typically during a recession, what we find is that the cost of buying growth becomes cheaper. And so for those brands that can afford it, it's a great buying opportunity. It's a much cheaper time to buy market share. Now, that's all very well, of course. Not every brand has the spare cash flow to increase their marketing spend or to advertise at all. But if you've got the cash and you've got the cash and the courage, as I like to say, then a recession is a great buying opportunity, and it can be a great chance to gain market share or even kill some of your weaker competitors. COVID, I think, is going to be the same in a lot of ways, except there's this other thing, which is that some businesses simply cannot get that growth because they've got supply or distribution problems. So if you're for example, a restaurant or a pub, and you're forced to shut, then clearly all the brand advertising and all the activation work in the world is not going to increase your sales. So you have to overlay that on the normal. This is not a normal recession. If you're supply constrained, then that rule won't apply. So I would say the first learning is think about supply. Are you supply constrained or not? Think about consumer demand. Think about, are you in a category where people are still wanting to buy your products and services, or are things different? And if you are okay on both counts, you can still supply people, there's still healthy demand, then go for it with advertising. So if you're basic food, basic things like chocolate, home cooked food, you can still sell the product. There's good healthy demand for it. Demand for it's actually increased. Go for it. If you're a brand that's selling online, that you've got good distribution, and you're selling Tupperware, which I believe, for example, it's selling better than ever at the moment, advertise the hell out of your product. If you're a pub or a restaurant that's forced to shut, you may want to cut your advertising down to a sort of a bare minimum until the point where you can relaunch and then think like a startup again. So no general rules, but you need to think about your brand in your context. Next question from James. How would you approach getting buy-in from a CEO or a CFO to invest in long-term brand building, particularly if it's new to the business? Yeah, I do get that all the time. This presentation would be a good start. Get them to watch something like this. Get them, you can get me to come and talk to them. In fact, I do that quite a lot. But there are resources online, and there are a number of presentations like this that will be online via Google, through Think Google. There are presentations on YouTube. There are the books. But yes, ultimately, the way you convince a CEO is by showing that long-term brand building increases their profitability. It means more growth, more sales, fatter margins, higher response rates from their other communications, and ultimately they will make more money. And that's how you convince CEOs. I think we do ourselves a disservice sometimes by talking about brand building as a sort of touchy-feely thing. When we're talking about brand building, we often talk about increasing awareness, improving brand image, improving tracking measures. That's not the point of brand building. The point of brand building is it produces whacking great sales and profits. It's about making more money and making money that lasts, producing long-term increases in your cash flow. That's really what brand building is about. It's about long-term sustained cash flow. And that's the way you should be talking about it if you want to convince your CEO and your CFO. And I can help you. Okay, marketing in a downturn. There's always a temptation to cut budgets, and marketing is often the first budget they cut. What would you say to businesses looking to make short-term cost savings by cutting the brand? You might expect me to say, don't do it. Actually, for some businesses, that is the right decision. You have to think about your cash flow. And if your cash flow does not allow you to do brand advertising, then you may have to cut it in the short term. If you're a business that is in the current crisis, if demand for your products has collapsed, if supply of your products or or the parts and the materials that you use to make your products, if all those things have gone, then you may need to make short-term cuts, and that may mean that you have to cut some of your marketing and advertising for the time being. But actually, many businesses are not in that position. For example, in the current crisis, about 20% of businesses are making more money than they normally do. Demand is healthy in, for example, packaged goods, FMCG, basic food and drink, things that people consume in the home. Demand is healthy in the world of online shopping in many areas, and most areas. So there are many businesses that can still reap good ROI from marketing and advertising, including brand advertising. And in fact, what we're seeing is that many of the people who've cut their budgets just did it as a knee-jerk reaction, and they didn't need to. So think very, very hard about whether you really, really do need to cut that budget, because otherwise, I've seen this firsthand. Many companies, the minute the crisis hit, slashed their marketing budgets and missed out on a lot of sales that they could have made, which they just lost to their braver competitors. So think hard before you do it. Next question. Okay, so you mentioned a 72% brand split for leading brands. However, do you have a guide of total budget relative to revenue or profit for leading brands? There is some stuff on this in the book. I don't have the figures to hand, I'm afraid. But if you read the book called Effectiveness in Context, it does tell you what the sort of share of voice versus share of market ratio should be for big versus small brands. In fact, what you find is that big brands do get some economies of scale, and therefore they don't need to spend quite so much relative to their size. This is Mark Ritson alluded to this in something he wrote recently, which is that there are economies of scale for big brands versus small brands in many ways. So big brands tend to have better distribution. They tend to have better mental availability. They're more well known. They have better conversion. They have lower price sensitivity, so they make fatter margins. They have advantage over advantage, which means that, as Mark Ritson said recently, typically when it's David versus Goliath, it's Goliath that tends to win. Sorry, guys. Small brands have everything stacked against them, except for the brands that are small because they are new and innovative. So if you're a small brand that isn't a startup, I'm afraid you have everything stacked against you, and you typically have to work really hard. And that means you do, if you want to grow, have to typically spend a lot relative to your size. Sorry. Next question. What would be the ideal brand activation mix for B2B? Well, we have looked at this. So Peter Field and I published a small report last year that just looked at how things work in B2B. There's much less data on B2B, but what we found is that overall, the rules do look surprisingly similar. And in fact, the brand activation mix for B2B is not very different for B2C overall. It's slightly more tilted towards activation. I can't remember the precise number offhand, but there is a slight tilt towards activation, but it's not very strong. It's closer to 50-50, but not very, very different. There's more variation between B2C categories than there is between B2B and B2C. If you want to find out more, look for the report called 5 Principles of Effectiveness in B2B Marketing, which you can download it for free via the B2B Institute, which is the LinkedIn's sort of institute for research into B2B marketing. So it's a short report, and it will tell you how things work there. Next question. Are you finding that more and more brands are becoming guilty of relying on the short-term sugar hit that performance marketing provides? Yes. What we have found is that while brand building is becoming more important, actually what most people are doing is tilting towards activation. And that's a real problem. So what people are doing and what works are going in the opposite direction. Many marketers are becoming more short-term, and that is compromising their long-term success. I think one of the reasons for that is that more and more marketers are relying on short-term performance metrics. If you just rely on the short-term metrics, you'll do short-term things. So if you just measure success in terms of likes and clicks and all those other short-term metrics, then you'll tend to focus on things that maximize those short-term responses, and therefore you'll actually reduce your long-term growth and profit. So we really need to balance those short-term metrics with some longer-term metrics, some longer-term measures of success. Now that could mean, you know, focusing on brand tracking. I'm not actually a huge fan of questionnaire-based data because people don't understand their own behavior and their own motivations. I am much more interested in long-term behavioral and business metrics, market share, profit, those kinds of things, but also long-term digital behavior. So some of you may be aware of the fact that I've been working with Google, in fact, on looking at using search behavior as a long-term business metric. And in fact, I'm doing a seminar with the IPA and the Advertising Research Foundation this Wednesday afternoon here in the UK. It's a free 3-hour workshop for those of you who have got the stomach and the time for that. But I will be talking about how to use share of search, this is Google search data, as a long-term performance metric, which might help to counterbalance some of that short-termism and so lead people back in the direction of long-term business success. So I think that's quite a good place to wrap up because we are coming up to the end of our slot. So those of you who want to find more about this long-term metric, I would recommend come to the workshop on Wednesday afternoon. You can find it via the IPA website. You can find it via the ARF, or you can look for me on social media. And myself and James Hankins will be talking about share of search as a long-term business performance metric. So hope to see some of you there. Hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned some stuff. Sorry we couldn't answer all your questions, but hopefully I've made some little difference to your marketing effectiveness, and hopefully that might help you to make some more money. Thank you very much.